authentic and natural English.
Managemente, schedule, elefante, câmera. See that all of these words here are basically following the spelling of the word and how I would naturally say it based on the logic of my first language. But as you hear them, English speakers are not really going to be able to understand my speaking clearly, because the pronunciation of these words were not necessarily what the sounds in English are like. You see that all of these four words were pretty much mispronounced when we consider the English language, but for speakers of many different languages, these sounds would be precisely what their brain would sound like when they will look at these words. Now, this referencing that we start to create, if we start to learn a language through reading, it's something that is going to severely impact our speaking skills. So today we're here to discuss two very important skill sets that we have to develop when we're thinking about our English fluency. And the reality is here that when you read in a target language without properly identifying and getting used to the sounds that this language has, you often mispronounce and misunderstand. So if you didn't notice the four words that I was saying, it was management, schedule, elephant, and camera. Now you see that this specific sound, this is what the sound would be like for the English language. But what is it that it makes it sound like the English language, and why is it that it can be so delicate or difficult for people who speak romantic languages like my first language, Brazilian Portuguese? Now, let's take a look at two components of the English language that are extremely important for us to understand as we want to develop our spoken fluency. So the first one is that we have 44 sounds or 44 phonemes in the English language. So we have 5 vowels in the alphabet that would be the same as my alphabet. So I will look at the 5 vowels that we have in Brazilian Portuguese. I'll look at the English and say, well, they have the same sounds. But if I look at the quantity of sounds that Brazilian Portuguese has, will be less than 44. Well, the big difference here is in the sounds of vowels, which means that English is phonetically inconsistent. I cannot look at a word, take a look at the vowels, and just jump to the conclusion that they're going to be the same sound. So the letter that you see does not sound how you believe that it does. So this is pretty much when we get particularly difficult for students who they've been to a master's degree, for example, in Brazil, and they had to read texts in English because they had a text in front of them and they were able to recognize the ideas based on the similarity of spelling. However, when you are thinking in English, when you're kind of listening to that inner voice going through those words, the sounds that you make in your mind, they're not actually correspondent to the English language. So when you try to speak, you are kind of reproducing those same types of mistakes. So it's important for us never to guess what the sound is, but to check the sound. So what you can see on screen now, basically what we have are the phonetic symbols of the English language. At the top, we're going to see the vowels and then the consonants. Now, you would see here in this particular case how one of the most common misconceptions for people who speak Brazilian Portuguese, for example, is the difference between the sound of sheep and ship. So the first one being the kind of what we call like the I in lowercase in the column. Basically, this is indicating that the sound is E and that it's a long vowel. So we say sheep. Now, the second one that is represented by the I in uppercase, the sound is not going to be an E, it's going to be an So it's ship versus sheep. So you see that these two, they are very clearly different sounds. They're in different spots in the IPA. So it's important for us to, number one, develop the awareness to listen to the sound and be able to identify the difference between these two, and also for us to learn how to produce these sounds differently as well. But the number one thing for us to consider is that there are some sounds that we're going to automatically associate based on our first language, that we cannot just make those conclusions. It's important for us to check. We can just go into a dictionary website. The first thing that you're going to see right at the top is going to be the IPA symbol. Once you more automatically associate the symbol with the sound, the easier it will become for you to just take a look at the symbol very quickly, and you already know what the pronunciation of the word will be without mispronouncing and without losing your confidence when you are speaking. So going back into the words that we have been discussing, management, schedule, elephant, and camera, let's start with the analysis of management. So you will see here in the spelling that I have 2 A's and 2 E's. But when I take a look at the phonetic symbols that represent this word, I have a very different picture here. So the first vowel that we have is similar to the word cat, is the e. In terms of that vowel, it's a vowel that doesn't necessarily exist by itself in my first language. So it's important for me, if I speak Brazilian Portuguese, that I learn to identify and produce the sound. After that, the second A is going to be the sound of schwa, which is represented with this as this E that is backwards. And it is the most important sound of the English language for us to keep in mind, because it is the most common sound that we have in the English language. Then the first E, you will see that there's no symbol for the first E. It's completely omitted. And then the second E is also going to be the sound of schwa. So keep in mind here then that the fact is that the second A and the second E, A and E, those are two different vowels, but they carry the same sound. In this case, they carry the sound of the schwa. So schedule, we have the S sound there for the first vowel. Elephant, the first E, kind of pretty much the same E as schedule in terms of the sound. And then for camera, the A is the same A as management, but we also have schwa. So the first thing for us to keep in mind is that it's important for us to take a look at the IPA symbol, learn how to quickly take a look at what the symbol is representing in terms of sounds, and pay attention to how different that is from our first language, to make sure that we know how to make these sounds, and we also learn how to identify these sounds as we listen to them, because it is going to pretty much play a big part when it comes to listening, and also clarity when we're thinking about the sounds that we are producing when we are talking to other people. So the first component here is really the sound awareness, making sure that we understand how many sounds we have in the English language and how they can differ from our first language, especially if we speak romantic languages. Which brings us to the second part of this that is just as important, and we're going to talk about the different types of languages in terms of speaking. So we're going to separate these into two groups. I did not invent this. This is basically part of linguistics. So we have a group of words that group of languages. We're going to call them syllable-based languages. So it could be Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and the phonological or phonetic logic of this language is that each syllable will have an equal weight when we are speaking. The rhythm is steady and regular when it comes to the pronunciation of these syllables. Vowels are clearly pronounced, and often we're going to have consonants that mark the start of the syllable. So it's important for us to pay attention to when we are thinking about syllable-based languages. Usually we're going to identify a consonant as the beginning of a syllable, which is very different from the English language. English is a stress-based language, which means that some syllables, some vowel sounds are stronger, some are weaker, and it's that kind of irregularity in the speech and in the power of the vowels that we are going to have the rhythm of the language. A lot of the vowels in this language, in English, they are reduced to the schwa, which is the sound of and also the stress is really what drives meaning and clarity. So auxiliary verbs, the contractions, all of those, they are weaker when we pronounce them, and then everything that is need to be better understood is going to be stressed when we're talking about stress-based languages. And this is very important because it impacts communication quite a bit. But more specifically today, we're going to talk about how that impacts our perception of syllables and how our perception of syllables can change how we speak. So going back into our words there. So when we're thinking about syllable-based languages, you are going to be pronouncing syllables from consonants. Your brain's going to try to follow the spelling of the word, and it's going to feel like you're trying to complete syllables that for you look incomplete. So in the second word that we have here, it's very common for people to say is schedule. Is schedule. So to add that vowel E right before this, because that's our perception of a syllable would be. Our brain would try to automatically try to complete that, what would look incomplete to us. But what we would say is ske, ske. There's no vowel sound that would be right there in the beginning. So if you are reading words in English and you're using the logic of your first language and you speak a syllable-based type of rhythm, you might be not matching what is the expected rhythm of the English language, which makes basically makes you a little bit less clear to understand. So there may be some more difficulties interacting or having conversations based on how we perceive our syllables. So some things for us to keep in mind is that every syllable has a nucleus, and the nucleus is going to be the vowel sound. It could also be a diphthong, triphthong, but the vowel sound is going to be the nucleus of that vowel. And the nucleus is what carries the voice, the energy, or the stress when we are actually pronouncing that particular type of syllable. Now, a syllable is always going to have a nucleus, and then you have two other parts. We have the onset. Onset would be the starting consonant shape of that vowel. And we also have coda, which would be the ending consonant shape. So a syllable could have an onset and a nucleus and coda. It could have both onset, then the nucleus and the coda, or it could have nothing. It could be just the nucleus. All of these, they would be different shapes that a syllable could take. And we can take a look at the examples at the words there. So the first one is for management. So this is one that becomes very clear when we think about how we say syllables impact, or how we perceive the syllables can impact how we say the word. So based on the logic of my first language, I would say management, and then probably I will try to add an E at the end there. So we say management. But when we take a look at the IPA symbol, you see that the first syllable is man, M-A-E. So that basically goes back into what we discussed before. So we have the M, which is the starting position of this nucleus. We have the vowel sound A, and then we have the N as the coda, the ending shape that we have. So men, management, and then they have edge, the sound of the schwa with the what looks like a D and a Z in some way there, which is a very specific sound for the English language. You can take a look at the IPA. And then ment for the M. And then what we have at the end there is a consonant cluster of the N and the T as the coda. So you see here that we have 3 syllables actually to the word management. So how we say this, instead of saying management, that second part that sounds, for example, from the logic of my first language, Brazilian Portuguese, it's important for me to basically learn how to identify the syllables and the units of sound more accurately. The sound of schedule that we have there, and then elephant. Elephant is also a very interesting one because we do have, again, we have 2 different vowels, E and A, E-L-E-P-H-A-N-T. But then 2 of these vowels, they have the same sound, even though they are different. So the second E is a schwa, and the A is also a schwa. The first E is the E. And then when we take a look at that, the syllable separation, it's also very different from what I would expect in my first language, Brazilian Portuguese. I would say this as elephant. So in this case, you will see that the le, that the starting consonant carries a lot of the power of that syllable. When I shift that to how I listen to the English sound, it goes into elephant, elephant. So you see that the L is not really the starting position of the LE, but it is the ending position of the first E. And that really changes the dynamic of the sound. And then the same would go for the word camera, camera. You would see that the E in that sound is basically not there. It's completely omitted. There's no symbol corresponding to that sound. So this is a way that we have to analyze both the IPA and also how our syllable awareness influences how we speak. Now, let's take a look at this in a bigger context, in a longer text. So let's imagine that our objective here is basically to do mirroring, for you to basically be able to follow everything from these words, as I say, word by word, at the same speed and the same kind of cadence. You would potentially try to put a recorder next to you so you can record yourself while you say it, and then you can double check the two of us. So let's imagine, for instance, that I don't have a lot of experience with English, and a lot of my experience is just because I can identify the pattern of words. So if I'm reading this and I have my inner speech, like my voice in my head that I can listen to while I read words, I would see something probably like this, and not thinking as much as possible in my first language, Brazilian Portuguese. So te Wildlife documentary creu carefully planned their filming schedule, coordinating every detail of a production management before aging into the reserve. So you see here, as much as I could, I try to put the same logic of the sounds that I would go in my first language, and you see that maybe there will be a part of me that will say, you know what, I understand what the sentence is saying, because I'm going with the idea like coordinating is a word that is similar to Brazilian Portuguese, production, and all of these other words that I could potentially try to identify. But then if I try to use that logic when I'm speaking, I'm going to feel that I am communicating because I am focusing on the spelling, but when it comes to the sound, that does not correspond to what we would say in the English language. So this is a mirroring exercise. I am going to read this, basically this paragraph, and you can follow after me. You can pause at the end of each one of the sentences. And yeah, so let's get started with this quick practice. The wildlife documentary crew carefully planned their filming schedule, coordinating every detail of production management before heading into the reserve. As the sun rose, the lead cameraman adjusted his camera to capture a herd of elephants moving slowly across the landscape, their footsteps almost silent against the dry foliage. Despite the complexity of the environment and the tight timeline, the team maintained clear communication, ensuring that each shot contributed meaningfully to the final project. So you see that I also have included the IPA transcript of this paragraph. So if you have any questions about specific words, you can take a look there to help you with the clarity of the understanding and the pronunciation of these words. Now, if you want to improve your speaking, there are some tips here that I always recommend you keep in mind. First, always listen as you read. So if you're reading a book, make sure that you can get the audiobook and you can do both of them at the same time. So this will help you get used to the sounds of the language and making sure that you are not imagining the improper sounds. The second one is to mirror language as much as possible. So you can listen to a segment of the news and you're going to copy what you see, and you're also going to record yourself. The goal here is precision, for you to make sure that you are able to produce the sounds exactly as you see them. Now, another tip is make sure that you broaden your syllable awareness and apply the knowledge when you speak. Um, you don't have to necessarily make sure check every single word to make sure that you check every single syllable separation that is necessary, but pay attention to these guidelines that we mentioned, that usually the consonant sound is going to be either the beginning or the end of a syllable, and the stress, the more powerful sound of that syllable, is going to be the vowel sounds. So making sure that not only you remember this, but you put this into practice when you are speaking, even when you are doing exercises, when you're reading out loud. Last but not least, make sure that you keep the habit of checking the IPA symbol. The more you spend, for example, just trying to identify clearly or more quickly which sound corresponds to what symbol, the easier it will be for you to just go into the dictionary, check basically the IPA symbol, and quickly make a change into the pronunciation or speak with more clarity and more confidence as you continue learning about IPA and also syllable awareness. Now, I want to finish this lesson with a question. What word is easy for you to mispronounce because of how it is spelled? Now, again, what word is easy for you to mispronounce because of how it is spelled? You can write here in the comments on the chat. We're going to do a follow-up of this video soon. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Teacher Leo, and I have an announcement to make. I am officially accepting new private students through the ThinkInEnglish membership. It's a membership that will last 1 year, and for 1 year, I'm going to be your private teacher, recreating personalized lesson plan for you, a personalized practice guide, really depending on what your objectives are. You don't even have to have the same objective throughout the year. You could start thinking about a trip to an English-speaking country that you're going to take, then think about practicing for a job interview that is coming up. For 1 year, you're going to have a private teacher that is going to curate all of the materials and all of the development that are important for you to achieve your goals with the English language. So take a look at the link in the description, and I hope to hear from you soon. Have limited numbers of students that I can take right now, but feel free to take a look and reach out if you have any questions with info@secondnatureenglish.ca. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you next time.